I grew up in New York and Maryland, and I was born to a medical family. My father was a doctor, so we had a kind of science side to our family. But my family also was part of what people would probably call a fundamentalist sect. So my religious background was very strict and very intense. So really a lot of my story has been trying to put together that kind of scientific background, a very passionate religious background, and then I was also very interested in music and the arts, so that kind of artistic dimension as well. My first career was as an English professor. I taught college English, and I also was very committed in my faith. I'd had a kind of falling out with fundamentalism, but also felt that the spiritual dimension of life was very important to me. So some years into being an English teacher, I became part of a experimental and non-traditional little Christian congregation that formed outside of Washington, D.C. I ended up becoming the pastor or spiritual leader of that group, and I did that for 24 years. During that time, I started asking a lot of deeper questions about theology and spirituality, and I began writing about that. And my first book was published in 1998, and in 2006, I ended up leaving the pastorate because I was doing a lot of writing and getting a lot of invitations to speak about what I was writing about. So for these last several years, I've lived as a kind of a public speaker and writer. And I have a number of activist causes that I'm committed to. Entrenched belief systems engage people in meaning. Really, I think the practical function of those belief systems is they situate people in a story that gives them great meaning, and the community that lives by that story creates a deep sense of belonging. So one of the first things I think it's important to remember about any passionately committed community that has its own belief systems is that people are getting something very, very valuable out of participation in that group. And very often we see some negative consequences of that. For example, if that group, in its sense of who we are, the usness of that group, can create a lot of hostility toward anybody who's part of another us or who's part of them as far as that group's concerned. So I think when we start to realize some of the negative side effects of that us-them dualism, we can't just attack it without realizing to take that away from people is taking away things that are precious to them. So one of the things I try to do is first take seriously the need for meaning, the need for a story, the need for belonging, and not underestimate the personal, psychological, social benefits that people derive from that. And then maybe we can help people engage in a quest to evaluate those belief systems and to find ways of achieving the same meaning and a similar sense of belonging without being wedded to beliefs that are highly suspect and that bring all kinds of negative unintended consequences. I think, first of all, some people really hardly ever, if ever, question their belief system. It works incredibly well for them. And sometimes their way of making a living depends on it. The power that they exercise over others depends on it. I mean, there's an awful lot of reinforcements when you're in a belief system. And if you say it that way, at the center of the belief system, there's virtually no questioning. But at the fringes, there's more and more questioning the closer you get to the edge, partly because at the edge, people encounter people from other belief systems. And so now my way of seeing the world isn't the only one. When you're in the center, you maybe have never met anyone who doesn't share those beliefs. And of course, in today's world with movies and television, internet, and travel. Now, there's a lot more margin and a lot more vulnerable center. And so the irony is the people at the center have the most fear and the most anger, because in some ways they're the most vested in that community and they're getting the most out of it, and they have the most fear of whether they could even survive if that system didn't exist. Whereas the people out on the fringes, they're seeing, oh, people in other systems are surviving okay. And sometimes they're saying, wow, those people seem a little better off than we do. So very often, the greatest tension is not between people in this system and this system. It's between the people at the center and at the margins of that system. And the people at the center see the people at the margins who are asking questions and looking over the fence, so to speak, into another community. They see them as potential betrayers. And so the fear and the anger is very, very understandable. I have very little success in having, I can be respectful and kind and interested in the people at the center, but in terms of changing their viewpoint, I don't think it's going to change very soon. I spend most of my time with the people at the margins who know that something's not working, who have that sense that they're building on sand and that they're living in a glass house, and that they're beginning to wonder. And of course their fear is different. Their fear is, if I lose this system, and if I don't just join some other system, is there any way for me to find meaning? Is there any way for me to find coherence in my life? And I feel like I've been down that road. I understand that fear. And so I try to, in whatever way I can help people, it's largely empathy. Yeah, I know what it feels like. I've been there. Gandhi had a saying, what was it? First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I would probably say, in my experience, I'd add one. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they try to ignore you some more. Because what I've experienced in my writing is that people from my own religious tradition did ignore and then mock and then fight. But I think what's been very interesting is it's very hard when you question the presuppositions, almost the pre-critical assumptions of a community. It's very hard for them to fight with you, because to fight with you, they almost have to acknowledge these pre-critical assumptions. So the fight quickly leads to ignoring and almost pretending you don't exist, which is one of the reasons excommunications, inquisitions leading to excommunications are so important, because the person who's questioning the very foundations, the pre-critical foundations of our community, you can't fight with them without the community itself changing. So you just have to exclude them as quickly as possible. That seems to be what happens. But I think of the editor of a very popular Christian, or one of the editors of a very popular Christian magazine, who I once met in a hallway somewhere. And he said, "Oh, McLaren, I don't like you. I've read a couple of your books. I completely disagree with them." He says, "But it's strange. My sons have both left the Christian faith. And if they ever come to any kind of faith at all, it's probably going to be through your books. Somebody like you," he said. "So I disagree with you, but kind of hope you succeed." And then he walked away. I think we're in a very profound earthquake and shifting. The ground feels like it's moving out from so many of our traditional institutions. And of course, I come from a Christian background, so I know that best, but I've spent a lot of time with Muslim friends and Jewish friends and Hindu friends and Buddhist friends. And what's really remarkable to me is how this current shift in consciousness, the combination of science and philosophy and any number of other disciplines that are causing us to question our previous assumptions, it's affecting every religious community, every traditional religious community. And it's almost as if there's a deconstruction And then some people wonder whether that will just mean the death of religion. But I personally believe there are great treasures in our religious traditions. To just wipe them out and throw them away is incredibly wasteful. And I personally think it leaves vacuums that we're going to have to fill. And so my little motto is that the antidote to bad religion is usually not no religion, but it's good or better religion. So I think what we'll see is a kind of deconstruction. And then this period of anxiety and difficulty, it's almost as if you're on the trapeze and you've let go of the old one and you haven't quite seized that new one yet. And that feeling of weightlessness, and it can be both terrifying and exhilarating. It may be that that's where the word faith actually takes in some meaning, this sense that I've actually let go of something, which is, the old word repentance means rethinking. I rethought something and I had to let it go. But yet there's a sense of openness, open-handedness, that there's something new to be seized. But in that in-between time, it's delicate. It's and I think it calls for a kind of ethical gentleness with one another and patience, even though it's very urgent for us to get through this. Also, just human kindness and understanding how hard it is. I watched this over the last several years. The issue of LGBT equality becomes one of these boundary-breaking issues for a lot of people. And I had already gone through my own shift in this thinking. And after I went through a shift in my thinking, one of my sons came out. And at that moment, I felt myself living between my son's world and my father's world, where this was just inconceivable. And because I love my father and I love my son, I could kind of hold a space for them that was very hard for my father to make that reach. And I think for my son, he just couldn't understand how my father lived in a different world. But we were able to love one another in the midst of that reality. I think that's what helps us get through these times. Because I was a Christian pastor for 24 years, I think I know kind of in my skin and in my bones this very difficult balance that religious leaders have to walk. On the one hand, they're supposed to be leading a community into a genuine encounter with the divine. And at the same time, they have bills to pay and institution to maintain, and warring factions within the community, and all kinds of egos and mistakes and all the rest in the community that they're trying to hold together. It's not an easy place to be in. And this is one of the reasons I think that that the old idea of a religious leader simply as somebody who knows a bunch of religious lore or religious information and can operate the levers of an institution, it won't help us. We actually need leaders who can embody what is sometimes called a non-anxious presence in the middle of the stress, to not separate yourself from the stress, to be in it, but to somehow be able to be in it with charity or affection or love toward all the participants, even the ones who are at each other's throats, so to speak, and with this sense of confidence that we're going to get through this and that there is something beckoning us into a better place. And even there, I think we have to have some mercy and compassion for one another. A young, a 28-year-old who's new at this has certain challenges and certain advantages. And a 68-year-old who's been at it a long time has strengths, but also has some weaknesses. So this to me is a time when we all have something to offer and we all have a lot to learn. I see very much this, the possibility of something beautiful emerging from the kind of ruins, in some cases, of our religious communities or the warring factions. I'll just give an example. Because I grew up in a very fundamentalist and Bible-obsessed sect, I really studied the Bible. Unfortunately, the way we studied the Bible was to find a way to take every sentence and every phrase and fit it into a system of belief. But something happens when you lose confidence in your system of belief, and that starts to crumble around you. And then you go back and look at the biblical stories, and you see, oh, there is a deeper wisdom there if I let the stories work. One way I try to say it to people sometimes is that I think in the ancient world, before the scientific worldview and the methods of science, the way to make a hypothesis was to tell a story. And just as hypotheses are tested and either disproved or improved, I think ancient stories would be told and then enhanced and developed over time. We have many examples in literature where we can see a story that evolves over time. And sometimes, though, as soon as the story is written down, it can no longer evolve. And then a new story has to come up that's in tension with that old story. And it's been this wonderful discovery for me, someone who grew up in such a Bible-saturated environment, to kind of rediscover the Bible as these dueling stories and these evolving stories, and stories that where in some ways the meaning doesn't come like the moral of a story, but the meaning comes when you discern a kind of trajectory in the way these different stories are told. They're leaving things behind, they're embracing new metaphors and new images. In that way, you locate yourself in this long journey of searching and truth, of holding on to something, gaining something from it, but then saying, I've got to let that go and accept something else. That kind of trapeze and to the next trapeze. Then you start to see, oh, you actually learn that in this kind of storyline and unfolding of the biblical library. I think that's really helping many of us in the Christian faith to rediscover so many treasures in our own faith that actually give us the courage to continue the quest where we are at this point in the journey. Well, a question that I think is really on the front burner for people in the Christian tradition is, what do we mean when we say the word God? And in our tradition, we have a whole set of images and names, and that in some ways, some of them were grabbed and held for a while and then let go, and new ones emerged. Others have been remarkably consistent. But here we are in today's world, and knowing what we know and knowing something of what we don't know, and experiencing these shifts in consciousness, I think we're at a new place of needing fresh language for how we talk about God, and both maintaining some sense of reverence for this mystery that was almost contained in the name, but also being able to scrutinize and question some of the assumptions that went along with that word. And that's an incredibly important moment. It's almost as if, for many people in the world of science, that it had a kind of reductionist tendency to flatten everything into numbers and zeros and ones and so on. And in our religious community, we tended to box the universe and into this defined set of definitions, of assumptions. Now it's almost as if both of these communities are coming to a place where we have to open up some space for mystery. And how we do that is one of our greatest challenges.